You're the ninth person that I've talked to so far about this, so hopefully some people are going to start talking.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Well, breaking news, Buster Murdaugh has just released a statement on the death of Stephen Smith, and this is as the Smith family plans to exhume the body. This is Buster's statement in full. I have tried my best to ignore the vicious rumors about my involvement in Stephen Smith's tragic death that continue to be published in the media as I grieve over the brutal murders of my mother and brother. I love them so much and miss them terribly. I haven't spoken up until now because I want to live in private while I cope with their deaths and my father's incarceration. Before, during, and since my father's trial, I have been targeted and harassed by the media and followers of the story. This has gone on far too long. These baseless rumors of my involvement with Stephen and his death are false. Now, let's just stop there for a moment. It's quite interesting that he refers to not just his involvement with Stephen's death, but also his involvement with Stephen. He regards that as a rumor as well, which is quite interesting. So is aware of that as well. He goes on to say, quote, I unequivocally deny any involvement in his death, and my heart goes out to the Smith family. I am requesting that the media immediately stop publishing these defamatory comments and rumors about me, end quote. So I wonder if you've been following my analysis, what you would make of, what do you think the True Crime Rocket Science position is on Buster Murdaugh? Do you think True Crime Rocket Science has implicated him, or do you think something else? So if you don't know the answer to that, the answer is, for my part, I've noticed many people on my channel seem to be pushing the narrative that Buster is involved. And they don't seem to like me saying, based on the evidence I've looked at so far, that I don't think he is involved. And that doesn't mean the murders aren't linked in some shape or form to the Stephen Smith incident. It simply means I don't see a connection to Buster. And one reason is because of this. The blue paint chips are the number 3 clue we all missed, and I don't think there's a possibility that the paint comes from anything other than an industrial tool or industrial equipment or some sort of industrial container such as a dumpster or a signpost. In other words, I think we can exclude something like a bat. And so the mystery deepens when we ask, how does Stephen Smith start his nocturnal adventure here and end up here? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Once again, I want to thank you guys for subscribing to Team Peachtree. It's a channel that focuses on positive, inspiring messages, also things like fitness and travel, also epic stories. There's quite a lot of content up already. Go and check it out. If you haven't subscribed there, please do. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So there are going to be 3 more episodes in this series. We're about halfway through with this analysis. And I've got to tell you, when you follow Stephen's imputed route, either heading south towards Crocketville or north, he's got to pass several residences in order to reach his final destination. It is really disorientating to follow it on Google Maps or Google Earth. It just doesn't seem to make any sense that he is where he is, which is one reason why the incident feels staged and also strange. On the other hand, if you put yourself in his shoes, it was between 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning when the incident happened, and probably that factor may have played a role in Stephen not calling for assistance. If you put yourself in his shoes, it's 1 o'clock in the morning and you've run out of fuel, would you call someone? If you're a teenage boy, would you feel that you have every justification in calling to wake someone up and they must now get up and drive to you in the middle of the night? Now, in the same way that there are often major surprises in true crime, such as the Idaho suspect leaving a knife sheath with his DNA at the scene. That was a big surprise and a big mistake. Or Chris Watts recording himself on camera with his kids running around the driveway, right, a CCTV camera on the morning of his crime. Not everything makes sense. Not everything is the most intelligent thing. And so if you bear in mind this is very late at night, did Stephen take a wrong turn either while driving or while walking? Did he end up where he was because he wasn't fully awake? Or when he got out, was he walking deliberately and consciously to a particular point in that vicinity? Was he trying to find his way, for example, to his grandfather's home? That is hard to answer without knowing where his grandfather lives or where his own home is for that matter. Also, where was he driving from that night, and why was he out on the road so late after midnight? Well, we'll be addressing those questions and answering them in the next episode. But if we put these concerns aside for the moment and we deal with what we know that the incident happened between 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning. This could also lead to a sleepy driver who perhaps strayed across the road when the road curved. The driver may also have subconsciously followed those overhead lines, right? I think it's telephone lines, and then corrected as the road curved under the hood of the truck. And now we come to a really interesting aspect that I dare say I haven't thought about in any detail until now, and perhaps you haven't either, the reenactment. Now, if you look at the schematic, it appears that Stephen was walking on the road, right? If you look at where he was found, there's a sense that he had to be walking on the road in order to be struck in the first place and to end up still lying on the road after being struck. Does that make sense? The other thing that I think is important to think about is if he was walking on the road, what side of the road was he walking on? And so from the schematic, it looks like his body comes to a rest more on the left side of the road than the right side, right? In other words, he was walking towards approaching traffic. And that is how people often walk when they're walking on a road. That's certainly how I do it. And so it looks like he was walking towards approaching traffic on the left side when he was struck from the front by a vehicle approaching from the front again on the left side. So these assumptions are based on the following. If he was struck from behind, he would more likely be found face down. He was not found face down. He was found lying on his back with his arms almost outstretched on either side. If he was struck from behind, he would not have the sharp force trauma. He would not have that sharp projectile type injury to the front of his face above the right eye. And so that also suggests he was struck from the front. It's also assumed that after he was struck, he fell backwards and skidded across the road, which led to him ending up close to the central line. You could also imagine if he was struck hard enough that it would almost kick his legs up into the air, right? The fact that he has no road rash on his legs suggests that he was struck on his upper body hard enough to dislocate his shoulder. That was sort of the center of gravity for where he got struck, and also hard enough to launch him in the air a few feet, but not hard enough to remove his shoes or for him to slide any length, any extended distance for him to lose the skin on his legs. So the object that struck him could have been a relatively slow-moving truck or tractor-type vehicle with sharp spikes protruding from it, or some sort of farm equipment being hauled on a trailer, or some other item such as a boat or even timber that may have drifted across the road. I'm talking about a trailer that could have drifted across the road on a slight turn. And by the way, this idea of a timber truck was also one that was investigated by the investigators because they thought that was very likely. And on Google Maps images, you actually see some of these trucks in the recorded footage mapping this area. So it obviously is very common. The other important point to notice is that Stephen was wearing a black shirt and black shoes. Obviously, he was wearing tan khaki pants, and that's kind of also the color of perhaps the cornfield and to some extent the surrounding area. But that black shirt would have made him hard to see. That would have made him less visible at night. The mud on the underside of his shoes may be the reason that he chose to walk on the tar surface. The grass alongside would have been treacherous and perhaps muddy and slippery in the dark, seeing as though there was no path. So that may be why he was walking on the road. It's also possible a vehicle was passing another vehicle, overtaking another vehicle, and this led to the driver being temporarily blinded. In other words, someone's approaching him from behind. There's a light shining in his eye. Everywhere else is dark because there's no street lights. And perhaps Stephen was blinded by this as well, seeing two sets of lights approaching at the same time. And it's late at night and he can't see for a moment, and maybe underestimated the width of the road. Did the driver know that he struck Stephen? It's difficult to know. This stretch of road has bumpy bits, and the rattling of a rough road might disguise an impact. Also, the larger and heavier the vehicle, the less likely the driver would be to experience an impact. So I am suggesting this may have been an unintentional act, and also that it was likely part of a vehicle associated with farming. So a heavier, larger vehicle that sort of protrudes in certain unexpected ways. And that is what struck Stephen. A lot of equipment in this sort of rural setting does make use of, for example, telescopic arms. Even John Murdaugh's business page shows equipment such as cranes and loaders that have these telescopic arms. And the following images were posted by John Murdaugh of these exact types of farmyard and industrial equipment. And so all of these types of equipment, either on the road or being hauled on a trailer, might have pieces of it protruding slightly more to the side of the road than, for example, a normal vehicle. In other words, they would take up more space on a narrow road, and this was a narrow road. And so it could also be that while on the road, the driver lost some sort of control, or he underestimated the vehicle in some way. And that is a very common occurrence with these telescopic type vehicles. It could also be a situation that one of the metal struts used by a logging truck merely came loose. They're quite tall. They're about maybe 1.5, 2 meters high. And if one of these struts rattled loose, especially with timber juggling in the back and going around a slight corner, perhaps this is what struck Stephen right above the eye. It's the right height as well. Or even if some load was being recklessly hauled from one farm to another, in other words, it's actually being grappled by some sort of tractor implement, and now it's being taken from A to B, and it's sort of protruding to some extent, across the road more than it normally would. And perhaps the driver, the reason they chose to do this so late at night was to avoid traffic. And then the driver didn't anticipate someone walking on or near the side of the road. In this scenario, the driver of the vehicle could be just a random person, possibly unknown to the Murdaughs, right? And it could possibly Randy Murdaugh called Stephen's father as part of just a lawyer following up on a potential personal injury lead. The investigative notes also make reference to the possibility that a log truck may have struck Stephen. And the question is, do they operate between 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning? Now, I think much of this reasoning makes sense, but I have to say I'm not sure I'm comfortable with any explanation for why Stephen was where he was in the first place. It just seems odd. We can only really get the answer to that from his family, and if we have some idea where his grandfather stays, maybe then it'll make some sense. But then I also don't like the idea that he left his wallet in the vehicle and that the fuel cap was open. It could be that it's the mistake a teenager makes. He wasn't thinking about everything, and it was 1 or 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. I do think we can rule out a bat as a potential object that struck him based on the flakes of blue paint found in his clothing. So is there a connection to the Murdaughs at the end of the day? And I know there are a lot of rumors, but can we take it beyond rumors? Is there something beyond rumors? Is this a case where there's smoke but not fire in terms of the Murdaugh family? We do know that SLED have been pursuing a non-Murdaugh lead, but it's also possible that the industrial equipment was rented from John Murdaugh, right? Because they did look at equipment in the area and didn't find any blood traces on equipment in the area. So could it be from equipment that was not from the area? Also, if industrial equipment did spear Stephen Smith, did the driver or owner not notice anything splattered on the vehicle the next morning? Or did he notice? Did he realize he'd hit someone, and he just kept on driving? In the cold light of day, did he not notice, like the next morning, that there was some injury to his equipment and also something that looked like blood? And I suppose it could have been dismissed as hitting an animal, but didn't the Stephen Smith incident make the news? And if you think about it, the impact was enough to remove flakes of paint on a potential vehicle. So surely someone would notice that. And also, if petals of blood were left as well, didn't they notice that? According to some of the investigative notes, Sergeant Booker returned back to Charleston, and Lance Corporal Rowell and I began riding the area looking at possible logging sites. So that was investigated. They were all old sites that obviously had not been used recently. We then went to McMillan Farms on the same road, and Lance Corporal Rowell and I spoke with Mr. McMillan, who runs the farm. We asked if we could look at his trucks, and he agreed. He had a few C trucks that we looked at, but we did not see any damage or evidence of bodily fluid or blood. After speaking with Mr. McMillan, he advised that his trucks weren't running at this particular time, since there was no grain to haul. But do you see how this sort of industrial type equipment, that scenario explains why there might not be the ordinary debris of a typical vehicle pedestrian incident, and also explains why he was still wearing his shoes, because an industrial type vehicle like that wouldn't be capable of high speed. We also know that investigators checked other farm vehicles in the area, but apparently didn't find anything. So it was what was needed to check farm vehicles beyond that immediate area. So I'm not going to take it further than that, but in the next analysis we'll deal with where Stephen was on the night of his death, how far he drove, who he was in a relationship with, and how this information takes the narrative forward. And that'll be in the number 4 clue we all missed. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.